Thank you for joining us today on Vital for Colorado Radio. I am your on-air producer, Jon Ekstrom. We are part of the Connect and Collaborate Network through the Colorado Business Roundtable. Joining me, as always, is our host. He is the chairman and CEO of Vital for Colorado, also an attorney with Robinson, Waters, and O'Dorsio, Peter Moore.
John, thanks a lot. It's always fun to see you.
Yeah, always a pleasure to do this. We get to talk with people of interest and prominence all across Colorado, and today is no exception.
Well, today's a real treat. Only recently, in the last couple of years, I think I've met Patty Limerick, but I've heard your name for a long time. And we are honored to have you here. You're the faculty director and the chair of the Center of the American West at the University of Colorado. You've had roles recently in terms of the Colorado State Historian. I didn't even know we had one. I was pleased to learn about that. And you also are helping as an expert for something that Vital for Colorado supports, the Bighorn Leadership Program down in Colorado Springs.
So thank you for joining us.
Well,
Thanks
pleasure.
for joining us.
Well, thank you. Thank you. And the Bighorn Project has been wonderful and so spirit lifting to be. They've been spirit lifting and wonderful for several decades, and it's great to see it ongoing, and it brings people together, and exactly what we dream of civil conversation and disparate points of view, but congeniality.
Well, just to give a real plug for that, that's a program called the Bighorn Leadership Program. It's been in operation, I think, since about 2002. It was founded by a gentleman of prominence by the name of Rut Bridges, and it's covered many, many topics over the years. And then during the last 2 years, Vital for Colorado has been a prime sponsor of the program, but the approach is the same that it's always been, and try to provide strong information to people all throughout the state with the simple goal of trying to enhance and create better conversations about controversial issues.
Right, and it's really important, I think, for you, for Vital for Colorado, to get credit for not being a gatekeeper in a narrow way there, that people participate in that. The nice lady who I sat next to at lunch she is one ardent climate change response person. And
absolutely.
And it's a great thing to see her sitting in a congenial way next to somebody from the oil and gas industry, somebody from the solar industry. It's really...
Well, that's the whole point. Try to bring smart people together and provide information to them, and try to create better conversations, not trying to create results.
Right.
But rather the journey.
Right. And I just remembered that these are all to be confidential sessions that we took part in. So my luncheon report there could be about any number of people and has no specificity and discloses nothing, discloses not a thing except that what everybody...
You and I were there, though.
We were there, and...
That's self-disclosure. That's okay.
Yes, and I enjoyed the company is really all I've disclosed, and I enjoyed it because so many different perspectives were represented.
Well, Patty, in that way, we're kind of simpatico here. That's Vital's mission. We seek to be the voice of the rational middle. Where can we connect and collaborate? Not to do too much of a pun for the name of this show, but the Center for the American West has a very similar thrust, and you are the director and chair of that organization. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
About the organization, yes, I'm a co-founder of it, and there were many reasons why that seemed like a good idea. I've always dreamed of having universities, faculty, and students much more involved in the world around them than is often the case, because wonderful things happen in classrooms, and they are intensely relevant and intensely connected to the world beyond the classroom, and it means a lot for the students to see how much what they're talking about in the classes connect to the world. Right. Plus, I am not of the school that wants to separate college education from finding a good career. I become very fond of my students. I want them to be able to shelter themselves and feed themselves and feel satisfaction and meaning in life. So I really have always tried to push for skills that will be helpful to them in the workplace, because in fact I think those are skills that a human being in any line of work will want and will have just a better life for taking in evidence, weighing the evidence, not being a sucker. So those are really good skills, and I've become more and more and more, I'm not going to say shameless, but just full out and saying to my students, I am here to help you with your careers.
Wow. That's it's a tough balancing act in terms of academia, because you want one, to be sort of philosophical and understand complexities of the world, and do that sort of what can be used in a pejorative sense as the ivory tower. Some of that is really useful and instructive in terms of the way we think about the world, but there's also a practical application that needs to be adhered to, at least to some extent.
I think that the separating of those is a misfortune, because a person working in a consequential occupation, which could range from dentistry to waste management, that person should be able to perform practical, down-to-earth activities, and should be able to say every now and then, what am I doing? And am I doing it as well as I could be doing it? Am I doing it, did I just do it I don't really know much about the ethics of dentistry, but let's pretend that I do. So did I just perform a root canal that was not actually necessary? Did I jump too fast in my looking at the x-rays to think that there was a serious problem here? Should I have checked that out a little bit more? So everyone, and whatever they're practicing, should be capable of saying, we see in human history, we see many occasions where people just performed an act because they had been trained to do it and they knew they could do it.
Right.
And so to be able to perform that act well, but then to say, is this...
Yeah. Why?
Why? What did I just do?
Right.
And is there anything that I just did that provides a lesson I should learn that might change my course of action? So I can't think of a line of work where you shouldn't have that totally up and running.
Well, additionally, Patty, we're trying to have a society here, right?
Yes.
So you need people with a well-rounded understanding of the world and an understanding of history, whether that's a history of dentistry or a history of government. You know, understanding and interacting, we live in a constitutional democracy, a representative democracy. So it's important that you understand the levers of that, the history of that, so that as we're existing in the world beyond our profession, those things, we have a well-informed citizenry.
Absolutely. And I think one of the sillier things that happened in our conceptualization of higher education was that we separated educating our students, our enrolled tuition-paying students, from what we might do out in the world where we would talk to general citizens.
Right.
Well, what are those students if they're not general citizens?
Right.
So that was
they can vote.
I
didn't
know that we'd veer in this particular direction.
Oh, sorry, I don't know why we did, because I love students, so we went there for...
These arguments sound very familiar to me. The very founding of universities in America, because before Cardinal John Henry Newman wrote the book, the idea of a university, there weren't universities, there were colleges. It was a totally different pedagogical type approach. And the argument that both of you just advanced was his argument. And he advanced the idea of a liberal arts education for these reasons. And he meant that they should be applied to life lessons far beyond the university. It's sort of taking the ivory tower down to the streets.
Right.
And that book, I believe, became embodied in the original university curriculum, which is the Harvard curriculum, 1909, and that curriculum became the universities. But somewhere along the way, there was retrenchment. And
yes.
And
in fact, it does occur to me.
So that's very broad, but I think that's accurate.
Right, and I think it is within the range of possibility that our listeners now have been saying, what show is this? And is this the higher education today? But I am preoccupied with this issue because of its relevance to society and to the dilemmas of our times. And I had 42 students in my house last night, so that might be why you're hearing me talk about students. And they were speaking about very important issues of our world today, particularly about water, and water management was a topic we were really focused on there, with a very experienced expert there for them to talk to, who lives in that world and works in that world. So I have, the question was, what is the Center of the American West? And I went with joy. I went to talking about how I hope it makes a difference in students' lives, and I hope that the difference in their lives will make a difference in American society and how we conduct ourselves as citizens.
Well, one of the things that you brought up was the center strives to bring out the better angels of our nature. That is right near the front of the Center of the American West's website. It's in your bio. Can you expand on that idea a little bit? I think you have, but... Yes.
The better angels of our nature is quite ambitious and aspirational phrase, and Abraham Lincoln used it. crucial speeches at a time when the nation was breaking apart. And to wish, as the Civil War was setting in, to say that he hoped that the American people would be awakened by their better angels of their nature. If he could say that as the Civil War was starting, we can say that now.
Certainly. Even
as we experience tensions which are dramatically short of the tensions of the 1850s and, thank heavens, in the 1860s.
Right.
60s. So a wonderful friend and historian at Yale, Joanne Freeman, wrote a piece about how many duels there were before congressmen and between congressmen before Congress. Okay, there were many duels that congressmen fought and brawls that they engaged in the 19th century. So when we get to saying, these are very terrible times, we've never seen terrible times like that, you think,
well, we never have personally, but the country certainly has.
The country has, and that's not to say, well, let's just, the moral of that story is let's just fight with spirit and relief because now we know we've done it before. This historian, Joanne Freeman's, her point is that Congress is the place where we take our tensions and conflicts and where our operating theory and ideals are that people in Congress can talk those through.
Right.
So when she calls attention to the violence of the 19th century, she's not saying, so we don't need to worry.
Yeah, no, everything's hunky-dory. That's not
no, she's saying that is a very important cautionary tale to us, that Congress has to pull it together. Congress has to be the place of deliberation.
Well, you've just hit on 3 of our 7 principles. Vote for Colorado is really founded on a number of simple statements, and it started in 2013, and now close to 90,000 Colorado citizens have signed this pledge. 1,000 businesses, many public officials, but the 3 that I think you invoked, start off with, we believe in science, not hyperbole. We try to avoid the we versus they dichotomy, and we want people to understand, and we use a phrase in terms of the Colorado way, in terms of how things are resolved, but it really is true. If you look at Colorado politics in recent times, people of completely diverse points of view have gotten together and solved hard problems, have solved regional problems, and people that do that think that Colorado is distinct. We're potentially at risk of losing that through increasing partisanship. I don't think we quite have people caning each other in Congress yet, but it's more going that direction than hands across the aisle.
I feel that we have living among us a whole bunch of people who should be paired in public programs telling the stories of what they worked out with someone who might have seemed to be their opposite number. Right. So there's a bunch of them, and they still walk the earth with us, and bringing them into public forums. I don't know exactly which civic institution could be doing that, but someone at some civic institution is going to say, this is where we are needed. We need to bring, I'll just use, this was a public record event, I think, so I can just say that I had the best time in a conversation with former Democratic Governor Bill Ritter and former Republican Senator Hank Brown. I should say the former applies to the office they held, not to their partisan affiliation. But man, was that a good time. The two of them, who are old friends, so I certainly didn't forge any new alliance that wasn't there before, but they spoke. At one point I asked them about the funniest experiences they had when campaigning, and that was really good and really funny. And then I shifted to a topic of how families of public officials, what life is like for them, and both of them turned very serious and talked about what it means for a spouse and for children to have a public official as father and husband or wife or mother, and the tensions that public officials have to face, and the inquiry and the exploration of anything they ever said in any context. And it was a wonderful thing with these Republican and Democrat just reminding us that when we condemn politicians, which some people do, and we don't use the phrase public service, but we just speak of people who hold office and exercise petty power, and we lose the whole dimension of so many of those people. Let me just say, there are people in office who exercise petty power. I'm not denying that. But we so can be tempted to focus on those people and to miss the value of public service. So I will say one of the reasons why I wanted to form the Center of the American West and saw opportunities for it was meeting, I'll just say, I'll leave this a little bit vague so I'm not violating any confidence on this, but more than 20 years ago, I met some scientists from a federal agency that were dealing with an environmental legacy from 19th century extractive stuff, and they were trying to be helpful to a community, and the community, Colorado rural community, hated them. And I remember meeting these people at a coffee session before we had a conference, and I just thought, you do know about the tensions between rural Western communities and the federal government, right? You do know. You don't just walk in as innocents. And then I thought, they don't know. Their training is in hydrology and geochemistry. And so I don't think the geochemistry professor stops to say, oh, by the way, we'll get back to the water quality and analyzing techniques in a moment here. But right now I need to tell you that you're going to inherit a vast historical legacy. So that event for me was one of the key motivating moments of thinking somebody needs to be in there who is not a federal employee or state government employee or county government employee, but somebody who has that bigger picture in time, which again, I don't fault the hydrology professors for not saying, you're going to work on water, are you? Well, we need to get you toughened up. And so we brought the psychiatrist from the counseling services here to get you, but wouldn't be the worst idea. If you can't bring the psychiatrist from counseling services, which I think might make everyone in a rural community uncomfortable if you said, we brought a psychiatrist.
Just a shrink for you.
Yeah, right. But if you say, well, we have this historian, people can think, well, what is the historian doing here? We wanted to fight about the present here. We have some very strong feelings about the present, and we wanted just to get to fighting about that. Why did you bring in this historian? Well, historians have magic tricks. Many people instinctively will think they're going to be bored because they had to memorize dates in high school. And so it calms them to think, oh, no, we have an historian here. Well, for the next 15 minutes, I guess we'll just go into a slumber here.
I'll zone out here.
Yeah. And then it turns out that, in fact, in that, the historian is given an opportunity to get out of the present moment and ask people to journey with us in time to go back to the origins of the problem, almost always the problem that has brought people into a contentious public hearing. Or that problem, I've never been in a situation I can think of where that problem originated the day before yesterday. The problem always originated, maybe I've missed some opportunity to have something that's more recent, but the problems originated before the people in the room who are feisty were born.
Right.
And if we only start with the present moment, we're missing the chance to say, oh, the people of the past gave us an inheritance, and parts of that inheritance are wonderful and parts are burdensome, and that's ours to manage.
Maybe in a world of 30-second sound bites, and I've learned that Twitter is now double the length of its characters, but still not very much.
Right.
We lose the opportunity, and it perhaps doesn't pay as much because being a cynic, I believe a lot of the conflict is economically driven because people are just making money off it. But be that as may, we need more people. Statesmen to tell stories, and telling stories is still history, and by telling history you teach lessons, and as it relates to many of the conflicts that exist today, the real truth is that there are so many people actually working together commonly with regard to most issues, and the very, very contentious issues are relatively few.
Right.
But we can't focus, if I'm hearing you correctly, on those few without understanding what happened before and the areas of commonality that we do have.
Right.
Well, and I think that's a good segue into talking about something you wrote recently in Colorado Politics, which is the urban-rural divide, which is certainly something that has existed. I mean, you cite William Jennings Bryan in the intro of this, in something that he said in 1896. And we are experiencing it in a much different way today, or perhaps the same way. But can you expand upon this article a little bit?
Sure. So one of the most important, most central stories in American history originates in the fact, excuse me, one of the most central stories in American history has as its origin the fact that it was a nation of farmers. Excuse me, I don't know what's happening with articulation here. So anyway, so we had a nation of farmers, and then over the next centuries, the proportion of farmers in the American population contracted.
Right.
And now it is really a tiny proportion of the population.
It's like 2% from what I've heard.
Right. And many of those people are working outside jobs in order to have the hobby of a farm on that, or the privilege of a farm, or
Certainly.
the meaning of a farm. So that is a very unsettling change. If you can look at the 200 years, you can think, no wonder the gears grind on that. No wonder the tensions and the sparks come on that, because you have a very empowered economic sector, the economic sector of farming, and then you have that shrink. So that's not going to go. That's not going to be comfortable as a transition. So and of course there are many different rural enterprises besides farming, and some of those are fairly recent onset of recreation. Outdoor recreation, which it seems to be a very innocent thing where you simply go out and enjoy nature and love nature. Well, you go out and enjoy and love nature, and you do that by driving usually a car that is powered by fossil fuels. So to say that you have moved from the extraction economy to the recreational world is to think that's a long walk if you're going to take that. You won't really have much spirit for hiking by the time you get to your destination if you're taking that. So
You will have hiked.
You will have hiked. You will have hiked.
You'll have dropped the skis from your back by the time you get
Yes,
to
you'll
the
have said
mountains.
you'll have had. They did that on the Overland Trail. They carried too much stuff, and they thought they were weighing themselves down, so they dumped it along the way. So we would see skis along the highways on that. So in any case, that's a really important point, that actually recreation and extraction are very intertwined, and to treat them as if they were opposed forms of life on the planet is that doesn't work. That's separating two things that are mixed
having
together.
done work on the western slope of Colorado in the oil and gas industry, the recreation community, you're right, they are very intertwined. They're very symbiotic in a lot of ways, because there are mitigation practices, there are conservation projects that become part of an oil and gas extraction process. And to see that up close and to talk to people who are on the ground, these are not people pie in the sky. They're not miles removed from it. They live there, and they said, we would not be able to, say, add trout to this new reservoir that we have without the support of the oil and gas industry. It's an interesting way of looking at it when you're on the ground and it's in front of you.
Right. And in many situations, Wyoming probably presents the best case. The Grand Teton National Park, Rockefeller money made a lot of that possible. The biggest oil fortune, Rockefeller, and land acquisitions that they made in the proximity to the Tetons, and that then ended up in the national park. That is something just to keep an eye. Every once in a while, apparently, some company or some individual in Colorado will take the image of the Grand Tetons and use it to advertise a resort in Colorado. So we might as well just let the boundaries go and take the Tetons, because if you think about the Tetons, you know how intertwined oil and gas and nature preservation can be. That doesn't mean that we're stuck in a pattern from the past that we can't change. We have all sorts of options of choice of how we adjust that relationship, but to act as if these are simply opposed forces or ways of being.
That they're mutually exclusive is incorrect and extremely incomplete.
Without the petrochemicals that go into lightweight outdoor gear, the number of people who would be engaged by wilderness issues, who would be political advocates of that, without the petrochemicals of the hiking equipment, hiking clothes, it changes the political support for wilderness tremendously if you withdraw that.
Without the long-term low-cost energy, they couldn't afford to get there in the first place.
Right. They could pay more. They could claim innocence, and then they would just have to see how much a ski resort is a sculpted landscape, how much how much work has gone in, and exercise of often fossil fuel driven machinery to make that happen. So I think as a young person, I enjoyed being very innocent. I was a very innocent person, and boo-hoo, I have been denied that sense of not being involved in the larger networks.
Well, I'll tell you what, we'll pick this up in our next segment. Patty Limerick is the faculty director and chair of the board of the Center of the American West at University of Colorado. This is Vital for Colorado Radio. Peter Moore is our host, chairman and CEO. We'll be right back. Thank you for staying with us on Vital for Colorado Radio. I am your on-air producer, Jon Ekstrom. We're here with Patty Limerick from the Center for the American West and Peter Moore, the chairman and CEO of Vital. Peter, before we jump into the next segment, tell us a little bit about Vital.
Well, thanks a lot, John. Vital for Colorado is a nonprofit. We've been in operation since the fall of 2013. I think our original aspirations were to try to advocate for what we called responsible energy policy. We did so through a 7-principle pledge that it really have some very, very basic ideas, such as we believe in science, not hyperbole, and we try to avoid political polarization.
We believe in all of the above.
We believe in all of the above energy. We want people to understand the economic impact, and we want people to understand how responsive the regulatory system in Colorado is. From my point of view, we're not advocating for a result. We're advocating for a predictable process. And people have liked that basic message. And over the 5 years, we now have somewhere around 88,000 people, we say almost 90,000 people that have signed a pledge either electronically or by pen, over 1,000 businesses and 180 trade associations. So we view ourselves as the voice of business to try to advocate for responsible energy policy. And you may wonder, why are we talking to an historian? And we're about to explain why, because much of what you're talking about, Patty, is directly applicable to what we believe and what we think is necessary for the public discourse. So I see a direct relationship. But if you'd like to find out more about Vital for Colorado, please go to our website. It's the words Vital for Colorado spelled out .com, and we're run by a 14-person board of directors, presidents of many chambers of commerce, but also presidents of business, and we have a mayor, and it's a very, very good group.
And if you want to find that pledge, go to vitalforcolorado.com/pledge. You can sign it. And sign up for our mailing list. We have materials coming out all the time.
Thanks, Jim.
Thank you, Peter. So, Patty, we were talking in the last segment about the urban-rural divide, and wanted to expand upon that a little bit because, you know, you've got people living in rural centers and the work being done there, not only in recreation, but also agriculture and energy development, both in terms of oil and gas and things like wind. You know, most of the wind in this state is generated on the eastern plains, which is away from the population centers. So can you talk a little bit about the tensions that exist currently, and where do we go from here?
I would be very happy to take that on, because the urban-rural divide, at the very least, its configurations have shifted. It may not have been even that conspicuous in the early eras of Euro-American settlement in the West, or for that matter, Indian people before the arrival of Euro-Americans. There were towns and cities and communities, and that's why many tourists are at Mesa Verde today looking around at that. So the rural and urban ties might, I think it's fair to say that in some eras, those have been clearer and the better basis for alliances. That if you had a bunch of farms, you would need a place, you'd need a town to bring the crop.
Right. You need a marketplace.
Yes, and you would need transportation connections to even bigger marketplaces, and you would also need a place to buy equipment and to have fun.
Right.
And to hang out.
God forbid.
Yeah, right. Well, that was quite a popular activity for much of Western history, has been having fun in interestingly mixed groups. In fact, I think you could say that people in the American West have spent dramatically more time chatting with each other and dining with each other and dancing with each other and, dare I say, having children with each other than they have spent fighting. So that's just a bigger picture for polarization. So anyway, so I do think that there was a much better reason for people in various forms of economic activity in the West to recognize the interdependence of the rural and urban. And if you had a mining town, you had a bunch of people who were not growing their own food, and so you created the mining town, created the reason for the rural settlement to have farmers come in to provide the crops that the miners were not growing for themselves, since they were in a whole other line of activity. So there is a form of extractive industry where there is no confusing the reliance of the community on that industry, so that people go to work in mining towns because there's a mining a mine there, and that's where they're going to have a job. But they don't settle and then think, good heavens, we're next to a mine. Good heavens, that's not anything we'd planned. That was the whole reason to be there. I believe that has become frayed now. And with maybe especially along the Front Range, it's very possible for people living in a suburb to think, we don't want this industrial extractive industry near us, and we don't see the direct benefit to us. 19th century West, that wouldn't have been a question that would come up. It would be, well, there's a mine.
Yeah.
We're miners. That's why we're here. So, and we're farmers supplying the miners. That's why we're here. So,
or I'm a shopkeep providing provision.
Right. Mercantile stuff. Yeah.
Get to the mine staff.
Right. In fact, just
loss of perception of connection between one community to another.
Exactly. And it is the word disconnect. I will say this about the many things I like about young people today, and one of them is that they get that right away. If you they got it probably before they came into your class, that there is a real disconnect between how the majority of Americans live and where the resources come from. The word, as soon as you say the production consumption disconnect, the students don't say, what are you talking about? We grow all our own food. My family and I we've always done that. I mean, they don't say that. They don't say, we actually have chosen to use our exercise equipment. So we're all fitness people in my family, and we use our exercise equipment to generate the electricity we use as we serve as turbine chargers ourselves. Well, no. So everybody knows that they live in a situation where they are very disconnected from the production of what gives them their comfort. The phrase I am working very hard to install in the public mind is the phrase that describes the last 100 or so years, the era of improbable comfort made possible by a truly astonishing but taken for granted infrastructure. And people, the fifth time you say that, it just comes off the off the tongue, but it's not quite a household word yet, or household.
It takes a little practice.
Yes, but it's a great phrase.
I think you need an acronym.
Thank you, and I'll stand by for you to give me that.
Or perhaps a limerick.
A limerick would probably be the better delivery system on that. Anyway, this notion that an infrastructure just is working all the time and bringing us these products, and so we turn on a faucet, water. Right. We start the ignition in a car. Well, gasoline's in the engine. We flip a switch. So the kids are attuned to that, and I see a lot of value in the fact that you don't get really any pushback from a 18 to 22-year-old who says, well, I don't know what you're talking about. We're really very self-reliant. They know that they depend on these products and services, and they know that their iPhones are part of this whole chain as well. And so if we can get that back into play, and if we can mobilize that, and I don't see any reason why we couldn't, then the urban-rural divide, which is vast in our state and in our nation, that's a problem of the mind. It is not a problem of the strawberries that we have for breakfast, because they are an agricultural water transfer. The strawberries were raised by the application of water to a field that is distant from us, and then it comes to us. And so it is all very connected. Water is probably the major connector of that, but the strawberries didn't walk there to our to our urban markets, so that the energy subsidy of the transfer of food. So it's all around us, a chance to think, oh, we might have had moments where we thought we were self-reliant and isolated, but as soon as we look at our breakfast, we see, actually no.
Well, I think about the proliferation of like farm-to-table restaurants as being an offshoot of this, where you can go to a restaurant and it will tell you where the animal was raised. You know, the name of the farm, the name of the rancher,
the name of the animal. Sometimes, if you maybe you don't want to know, but
I suspect that might be a bridge too far for some people. A little bit of anthropomorphization of the animal. Let's talk to Mike Donafon about that. But the thing about it is, that connects you immediately in the mind to a place where you are not.
Well, so you're going to love my idea for, we start with 1 day a year. This has been proposed by me to the Colorado Water Congress and was well received. So we begin with just 1 day a year, but we probably go past that. On that day, if you go to a restaurant in Colorado, the waiter says to you, would you like bottled water, or would you like tap water. If you say what I think the majority of people say, I would like tap water, then the waiter says, well, I would love to get you the tap water, but I cannot do that until I know that you know the origins of the water that comes through our taps. And as soon as I know that you know that, I will get you refills. You'll just have plenty of water, but I can't do that until you have given me some evidence that you know the connection. And maybe the first time we have this day, the first year, nobody gets any more tap water. So, but then people think, oh, Lord, it's that day. We have to find that out. And so then the Colorado Water Managers, which is a wonderful group of very, very determined, very persistent, very effective people, they prepare a certificate. And it might be some association or affiliation. It could be, any number of groups that could do that. And so if you, as a customer, if you do satisfy the waiter's request and you do get your tap water, you also get a certificate that is signed by knowledgeable people in the field of water management that certifies that you have recovered from obliviousness and amnesia. And those are suitable for framing. And
I really can tell that you're a university professor because you're forging connections between communities and giving certificates at the same time.
Yes, don't you think? Yes,
it warms
absolutely.
My heart.
Right, exactly right.
I would not leave the restaurant without a certificate. I want that certificate.
Yes.
I would want the water also.
Yes, and that's important that there's a material reward as well as the certificate. And as those certificates appear in people's homes, framed nicely, then jealousy and envy and I would like one of those.
A little bit of game theory, so to speak.
So more broadly, to just speak very briefly in the area that Vital for Colorado works on, in terms of in economics, the M1, M2, the secondary effects and secondary employment and tertiary and on it goes. But I think the most recent numbers that are commonly used is that there might be something close to 250,000 people in the state of Colorado that work in some form or fashion in the service industry or directly for an oil and gas company. And that's an entire community. And then we have all the rest of the people that aren't. Those 250,000 people create a very, very strong economic vertical. Could you apply this type of example to try to create community between that cohort of 250,000 people, very, very large and important, so the rest of the people it could be something as simple, we are oil and gas, and the people that are oil and gas are the people living in your community, you live down the street, your friend, your next door neighbor, the guy that pumps the gas for you, on it goes. How do you create that sense of community? Because I think the solutions to all of the fractious problems derive fundamentally by a loss of community. It wouldn't happen if there was a sense of community in the sense of the very beginnings of the state of Colorado, where it was so obvious and necessary in 1860 in Auraria to have community just to survive.
I think I would want to be maybe irritating to everyone first by saying that everyone wants to be listened to and very few people want to listen.
Right.
And that would be true of every sector.
Right.
So I certainly have seen evidence that the people who work in the oil and gas industry have a reason to feel unlistened to or quickly dismissed or categorized or stereotyped. And that does nothing to relieve them the burden of listening to others.
Absolutely.
So, and I think that the sense of grievance that comes from not being listened to, that just ricochets around. And as my friend Dan Camus, who was the mayor of Missoula, used to say, it's interesting that we call these things public hearings when the one thing that is not happening is hearing there. So a little bit comical that would be our term.
Like a public airing.
A public airing or public, I am saying the same thing I said the last time I was here, and I'm planning to say it again. So, and I will say that's one reason why an historian can be a very good feature, because it takes you out of, you may know that you are going to dislike the historian and disagree with her point of view, but you actually have to listen a little bit to find out what this irritating and unpleasant point of view is before you can condemn it. So my strongest sense with all of this is that the most understaffed occupation or profession or public service mode is the moderator who sits in the middle and conducts the conversation, which of course means that people in the middle can still speak. Because in fact, I would say the notion of there being two sides to any issue is just comical, because each side has so many divisions within it.
Right.
And the notion that there are these two phalanxes that are people in the same T-shirts who are just of one mind, that's not happening. So
it's not as binary as it might seem.
no, which is good, which is fine. But that if you think of what any contact sport would be if you didn't have referees on the field, and we may be concerned now, as we probably have every reason to be, about injuries and contact sports, pull the referees out, and the emergency rooms have a big upsurge in business on that. So the notion that we so often conduct public debate with no moderator, no umpire, no referee, or with a pathetic one. I mean, the poor souls. I feel so sad for the people who are supposed to be the moderators at presidential debates, who are just overpowered, pathetic figures. I mean, I'm sorry to be so rude to them, but I can't bear to watch it, because I just think, if you're the moderator and you said to the debater, which I have said in many public situations, I have said, if somebody is not playing a helpful part in a conversation and has gone into personal attack, as the faculty director of the Center of the American West, maybe the tiniest bit encroaching on other people's First Amendment rights, but it's in a good cause, so I'll just take the lawsuits. But it just turns out, nobody has sued me for this yet, but if I say to a person who is stridently attacking another individual, if I say, I'm going to ask you to stop there, and I'm going to ask you to reframe that, so I know you have a strong position you want to express. Right now, we've lost that, because you turned it into a personal attack. So that's not really going to get your point as you want it out there. So I'm coming back to you in 10 minutes. I'm going to ask you to make the point, but I'm going to propose for your own purposes that you drop the part that was a personal attack and get to the substance of what you wanted to say. So I never say, you are bad, you have to leave, and you are not a citizen I would want to have in here. I say, I want you in here, but I want you in an effective mode.
Right.
So more people doing that, with more and more of them 23 or 21. We are so underutilizing the disarming powers of young people. It is the goofiest failure to use a very renewable resource. I'm happy to be on the board of State History Day. I run the annual meeting where we get to see the work of the students. Just did that. Young people who are pushing 18, that would be the oldest of our folks there, they have written papers on extremely controversial subjects, and they have really serious subjects, and they have done it in an exemplary way of careful weighing of evidence and point of view. And then they give presentations, and I have to bring a handkerchief when I'm moderating these. There's nothing to moderate there when I'm just the MC, because it is so moving to see these young people just so much setting an example for their elders, and their elders are, the elders who need to see that aren't there with us.
They're not paying attention either.
No.
Well, I mean, you're dancing around a point here where we've been talking about political polarization and devolving into attacks and almost trench warfare, and we're not working together to bridge the divide that we have, that exists, that seems to be growing. I think if you asked most people, is polarization worse now, or pick a time in the past, most people would say now. I mean, and you've articulated some solutions to this, but how do we move past that? How do we build a better society? How do we talk to each other?
Well, Dr. Limerick, one of the things I just wrote down is that the strategy that you're advocating, I think, is to reduce the sense of grievance by increasing the opportunities for each party, each community to be heard. And if that function is done effectively, perhaps through a moderator, then you can have an opportunity to then determine the commonalities that may exist between the anti and the pro. And you won't solve every problem, but you'll solve a lot of problems, and you'll reduce the polarization. That's the argument that I heard you make.
Yes, and I would borrow, probably not with complete accuracy of the terms, but I would borrow the terms for the scientists of noise versus signal. So if you can point out the noise, which in my opinion is the personal attack and the exaggerated rhetoric and so on, cut that noise and go for the signal, go for the actual content, then you will end up with some solid, challenging disagreements. you'll have that. But at least you'll have, in my opinion, you would have cut it to maybe 10% of, if you've taken the 90%, which is noise, out of the picture, and then you have something you can work on.
So playing devil's advocate for a minute, I can see that that would work with people of goodwill that have a common goal of trying to solve the problem. How about when you have a situation where the dynamic motivates and rewards people to not work on the common problem? The goal is to not listen. The goal is to increase sense of grievance and to shine a light on yourself, for example. I won't talk about particular things, but I can think of things I watched on television the last couple of days. People were allegedly debating things. They weren't debating a darn thing. They were just grandstanding and trying to fight.
Well, right. And I think this will seem a little bit contradictory, but if you can get that to be performed in a very visible way, that allows the people who are not inclined in that direction to think that's not persuasive.
Right.
So
and it's not persuasive.
It's not persuasive. And so oddly, I would say letting that unroll where the people of goodwill can see that is a great way to clarify their own judgment. If they see somebody who is, I'll just go there because it's been recent, the people who shrieked and shouted at the Kavanaugh hearings. My sense is that they probably increased the voter turnout for the people who disagree with them. That they certainly were not, shouting and shrieking is not a very good form of communicating your perspective or point of view, partly because you're cut off very fast on that, and also I don't know what you can say that is worth hearing if you were. I'm not going to do it now because it would blast your. But if I were to start screeching at you, I think that would be difficult for the listeners, and the listeners hearing me screech would just say, "Oh man, we thought she was worth listening to, but good Lord, no. Could you turn that off, honey?" I mean, it would just be so
give them rope and have faith and hope that there's enough people of goodwill that really are trying to solve the problem.
Right.
And then get back to it.
Right. And then make sure that the people of goodwill leave with some sense of not being overpowered and silenced by the shrieking.
Well, I have done moderation before, and a lot of times people don't need you to necessarily solve their problems, but they need to know and they need acknowledgement that they've been heard.
Absolutely.
And there's a sense that we're not being heard necessarily. And you mentioned that with public hearings. You know, it's called a hearing, but we're not often heard. So.
I had a correspondent. We did a series, the Southern American West did a series called Fracking Sense, and I got a lot of interesting responses from that. One person was writing me, and I can be vague about this because I would have to be. He was a community member. He was not part of any strident group. He was really worried about his kids, about the potential for a oil and gas well, a fracking rig to be at a school, near a school where his children went. He was really concerned about that. He had concealed his email address from me. He concealed his name, and I'm thinking, why are you doing that? But his fear of penalties from his community was
being
intense.
outed.
And that so troubles me when people have reasons or believe they have reasons why free expression will put them at risk of punitive actions or retaliation. So, and that can happen. Anybody can have that. So watching that man, finally he slipped up and sent me a message with his name, so I know who he was. But it was just great to be able to have him to say, why are you so certain that you don't have the right of free expression, and how can we make sure that people like that do feel comfortable that they can speak?
Well, Patty, we can find you at centerwest.org. Thank you for being on the show. This was an enormous pleasure. Peter Moore, our chairman and CEO, always a pleasure to get to spend some time with you. You can find this show and every other in our history at vitalforpodcast.com. Go to the Learn tab, videos and podcasts. Thank you for joining us. Have a great day.